You're listening to Shadecore, where we discuss all things true crime. This is part 3 of the deep dive on Virginia Giuffre. In part 2, the last episode, I left off talking about how Virginia was introduced to Ghislaine Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein at the age of 16, how they groomed her, and all the different locations we know of that they operated out of with their sex trafficking ring. And we left off starting to talk about the famous wealthy people that Epstein is associated with. So this is going to be the final part of the deep dive on Virginia Giuffre, and we're going to discuss some famous people, corruption and scandal, as well as the trials. So hang tight, because you're about to go for a ride.
Not only was she going to Epstein's private homes and islands now, she was traveling with them or meeting up with them. And if she wasn't already aware, she was becoming a first-hand witness to all the connections they had among the rich, the famous, and the wealthy. And I mean all of the above. In her novel, Virginia describes sitting across the table from former President Bill Clinton, politician Al Gore,
who was sitting with his now ex-wife,
Tipper Gore. She was at a party for Naomi Campbell, who was also
celebrating her 31st birthday on a private yacht in Saint-Tropez in France. And yes, I'm talking about the British supermodel Vogue cover, magazine cover Naomi Campbell, who, by the way, she herself was with a much, much older man.
What is going on? Nobody noticed that there was a 17-year-old girl just hanging around Epstein? I mean, clearly they must have.
But then I looked up this boyfriend that Naomi Campbell was seen with on that Saint-Tropez yacht party. He's a scumbag as well. He's an Italian business mogul who was later convicted for tax fraud. He invested in F1 racing and the Benetton clothing company. By the way, later on, after Naomi Campbell, he went on to have a baby with Heidi Klum. And the two of them split after he was caught having an affair with a 19-year-old model. So she's raising that baby with the singer Seal now. Anyway, Flavio Briatore is also on the Epstein list, so it makes you realize that many people on that yacht may have been corrupt or associated with corrupt people and afraid to say anything. Same goes for any of these places that Virginia Giuffre found herself in. She was just around the wealthy, the elite, and the incredibly corrupt, wherever Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell brought her. It makes you realize why nobody did anything or cared when Virginia Giuffre, a 17-year-old girl, was hanging out with Epstein on that private yacht. And Naomi Campbell has also come out and said she was not aware of Epstein trafficking young girls at the time, so I'll give her the benefit of the doubt. And she herself is with a very old man, so makes you wonder. Sure, you can argue that she's after the money, but it makes you wonder why not just her, but Heidi Klum and all these other young models are dating these rich older men that are very shady, and what is going on in the entertainment industry as well. Jeffrey Epstein was a personal accountant for nearly 2 decades for billionaire founder of L Brands, Lex Wexner, also known as Leslie Wexner, which owns Victoria's Secret, Bath & Body Works, and Abercrombie & Fitch, as well as other businesses. Leslie Wexner completely denies to this day knowing about Epstein's activities with minors or being of any association to it. However, his name does come up quite a lot in Nobody's Girl, the book by Virginia, and he's also often named in Jeffrey Epstein's birthday book, which is officially titled The First 50 Years. It's a 3-volume book compiled by his associate Ghislaine Maxwell of notes and drawings, and it contains a mixture of well wishes and suggestive content from very well-known people. Mr. Wexner is one of them. His name comes up a lot, and his name comes up in Virginia Giuffre's book as well. One of the notes that Leslie Wexner left in the birthday book for Epstein says, "Dear Jeffrey, I wanted to get you what you wanted, so here it is." And it's a drawing of a pair of boobs, and it says, "Happy birthday, your friend Leslie." So that's been circulating on the internet. What do you think? Do you think he was involved? I know a letter and a note and drawing that's awkward doesn't prove anything, but the two own property together and they seem to have a lot of business deals. Again, Jeffrey Epstein was his advisor for 2 decades. So what do you think? Do you think he knew? Epstein also had a lot of pictures in his house of famous people that were not on the Epstein list that we know of, but they are very famous to just give you the magnitude of his power and access to people.
He also had a framed photo with the British royal family and a framed photo with the Dalai Lama. Jeffrey Epstein had a framed photo with Pole John Pope II. Even in Virginia's posthumous memoir, we didn't learn of every man that Epstein trafficked Giuffre to. She took some of these names to the grave. She mentions many prestigious academics, scientists. Epstein liked to surround himself with all types of innovative minds who were at the top of every industry, such as
Stephen Hawking, the famous British physicist who really is considered one of the most innovative and genius minds of our time, with his studies of space and physics, applied theories, and quantum mechanics, especially in the field where he studies black holes in outer space. He was also an inspiration to many due to his debilitating and degenerative disability with ALS. He lived for 50 years with that disorder, I believe. So despite all that, he's on the Epstein list. Then there was
the computer scientist who consulted Stanley Kubrick on 2001: A Space Odyssey, Marvin Minsky.
Marvin Minsky was considered a pioneer in the field of AI and computer science. He was known as the father of AI. So he was on the Epstein list. And one of the people that Virginia Giuffre was trafficked to.
The creator of The Simpsons, Matthew Groening. I was pissed too to learn about Noam Chomsky.
Mind you, I was a linguistics major in college, and he's a pioneer.
The pioneer who spearheaded the field of linguistics, like really even Noam Chomsky.
This guy was known for his political activism, being anti-war, and he was also listed as one of President Richard Nixon's political opponents. Really shows you that Jeffrey Epstein surrounded himself with the top of the pioneers of every field and really manipulated the system. This is all just also a very cruel reminder that you can't trust anyone, anybody that's successful or seems like they have a good front in the public eye.
So it's just the richest of the rich. Jeffrey Epstein seemed to have something on everybody he could blackmail them with. Epstein was also said to have kept a huge archive of videotapes recorded from inside of his house that he could supposedly blackmail anyone with. So not only did his connections run deep, but even if they wanted to incriminate him and come clean, he could flip the table on them, blackmail them with his connections or any recordings he had of them. And I can't emphasize enough of what a bully Ghislaine Maxwell continued to be, especially to the victims. One time, Virginia recalls staying in a hotel with Epstein and Ghislaine. It was a hotel in Morocco called the El Minza that looked straight over the Gibraltar and the Bay of Tangier. And apparently when they stayed at that hotel, a monkey had crawled through the window and took a shit on Virginia's bed. And apparently Ghislaine laughed about it and made a joke saying, maybe you should leave the window ajar tonight. That might be the way to find you a husband before you get any older. Like, ew, there are so many things wrong with that comment you just made. First of all, Virginia is 17 years old. She's not looking for a husband. And there's something very RAPE about a man crawling through your window. And not only that, a monkey took a crap on her bed. Like, that's just so rude and so objectifying on women. And not only that, it just shows how Ghislaine Maxwell is projecting about her own age, because clearly she's the one getting much older than Virginia Giuffre, and it's only an issue because she's surrounded by pedos. So the whole situation is just really pathetic and misogynistic coming from Ghislaine. Virginia was instructed to get her passport, and she was traveling soon to Morocco, France, Spain, London, Africa, all of the world, meeting affluent people and celebrities. And the one interesting thing that I'm not surprised about is that Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell never gave the names of these guys to Virginia Giuffre. I mean, they don't want these guys to be incriminated.
At least not by anyone other than them if they're going to be incriminated, right?
But after years of abuse and having been trafficked, she said that you never forget these faces. They're etched into your memories. And she would see news articles with the names of these millionaires on them, and she would recognize that they had been the ones assaulting her and that she had been getting trafficked to. So Ghislaine Maxwell and Epstein, they had all these wealthy friends. Ghislaine owned a house in Belravia in an affluent district in London. Like, boy, I learned so much about geography because I don't know so many of these places. I'm in a totally different income bracket than them, obviously. So Ghislaine owned a house in Belravia. That's around the time when Ghislaine Maxwell first introduced and trafficked Virginia Giuffre, who was only 17, to Prince Andrew on the morning of March 10th, 2001. Virginia did end up getting paid 15 grand for serving Prince Andrew as a child, let me remind you. AKA Randy Andy was his nickname at the time. But remember, she was still 17. She wasn't given a chance to understand what was going on, what she was going to be doing that day. They just sprung Prince Andrew on her. And whatever they told her, she had to do. So a month later, she encountered Prince Andrew again. And this time, she was made to actually have sexual intercourse with them. Before it was more a blowjob, but now it was sexual intercourse. And this time, another girl, another victim named Joanna Schoberg was present. Then there was a third time, and the final encounter Virginia had with Prince Andrew. And this time, it wouldn't be one, it wouldn't be two, it would be 8 other young girls, along with Virginia Giuffre, who were pleasing the Prince Andrew. And one of Jeffrey Epstein's pilots, David Andrews, the pilot, had made initial AP, which stood for the Prince Andrew, and the fact that he was flying Prince Andrew that day on July 4th, 2001, which meant that Virginia Giuffre was still a minor at that time when she was in that orgy, that SA orgy. And as you can imagine, Epstein's connections and payoffs also played a part in the hospitals among doctors. It's truly disturbing. But on July 8th, 2021, the same week that Virginia found herself in that orgy with 8 other underage girls for Prince Andrew, she had already been suffering from irregular bleeding, excruciating pain, cramping in her stomach, to the point that it was unbearable. One day she just woke up screaming and she was bleeding. So she was taken to New York Presbyterian Hospital, accompanied by none other than Jeffrey Epstein himself, where he lied about her birthday. He had the doctors medicate and sedate her so she couldn't recall or understand what was happening. Virginia eventually looked back on that time, thinking that what she had experienced was a miscarriage. After all, neither Jeffrey Epstein nor any of his colleagues were wearing condoms when they were hooking up and assaulting her. So that would make a lot of sense, right? And it's just so disturbing that there was a doctor that was bribed by Epstein to falsify her medical records and not report this abuse to anybody. Which is like, you're a doctor, you're a mandated reporter, you should be doing that, hello. And remember the guy that I mentioned earlier, Michael, the guy that moved into Virginia's apartment, the guy she had been living with before Epstein gave her money for that apartment? Well, the two had this don't ask, don't tell codependent relationship. But at this point, she was no longer living with him. A familiar friend from much earlier years, Tony Figueroa, had moved in. And if you listen to part 1 from last week, Tony Figueroa was Virginia's neighborhood boyfriend, or neighborhood boy toy, you could say, that she was having sex with. She had taken everything she had learned from her dad and her abuser, both of them are her abusers, Forrest, and she was reenacting it on Tony Figueroa. And she actually ended up taking his virginity when they were very, very young before she was sent away. So let's just remind ourselves, when somebody is abused for so long, sexually abused as a child, they don't know what's normal. They don't know boundaries. All they can do is reenact what's been happening to them, which is why all these doctors I've mentioned so far, like the one that told Virginia's mom she had broken her hymen, and Virginia's mom was like, well, she's horseback riding. And then the doctor that Jeffrey Epstein took Virginia to see, they all blew it. They all took an oath to serve people, protect them, keep them safe, and they all blew it. They didn't even report any signs of trafficking, which they're supposed to do. They are mandated reporters. So anyway, the reason that Michael had moved out is because Tony Figueroa actually found Virginia one day. This is the boy I was just talking about, who was her neighborhood boy that she used to mess around with at a very young age. And he actually told her, "Where have you been? I've been looking all over for you." And I don't know if that was like normal in early 2000s. I don't know if maybe like a lot of people didn't have cell phones. But he had tracked her down to her new apartment. And they hadn't seen each other in 3 years since she was sent away to growing together by her own mother. Since then, Tony had filled out. He was wearing an oversized baggy t-shirt. He was listening to hip hop. And he had been struggling in his own life as well. So she doesn't go into too much of what he was struggling with. But she does mention that it really shifted things, because She liked that he had his own struggles and she could actually open up to him about her struggles with what she was going through with Epstein, and she didn't feel like he was judging her for it. Soon, the two hit it off, and then shortly after that, they were romantically involved again.
As soon as Michael figured out what was going on, he moved out. He didn't want to deal with that, and neither did Virginia. It was over between the two of them. She had moved on back to her old boyfriend, her neighborhood friend, I should say, Tony Figueroa.
Virginia could relate to Tony. She felt that she could talk to him about Epstein, and she did. She could confide in him. The two refer to Epstein as the other man, and just having someone Virginia could talk to who could check in with her after her long days with Epstein, that meant a lot to her. So Tony moved in. But Tony, he had a lot of issues. It made it hard for Virginia to break free of what was already a very difficult cycle and world that she was living in. Tony would cheat on Virginia, and one time, when she was trying to break free slowly from working for Epstein and trying to get on her own 2 feet and make money again, she got a job as a waitress at TGIF. However, when Tony came in on her lunch break to talk to her, he stole a stash of money from the tip jar and they fired her. And then soon after that, Jeffrey Epstein called her and she was back working for him again. A once obedient Virginia who wanted to impress Epstein and Ghislaine was starting to unravel, though. She was already self-medicating with prescription pills such as Xanax, or even taking acid to dissociate. Epstein became more and more sick of this. And he also became more and more sick in the head. He was becoming interested in S&M, or sadomasochism. And he began to hogtie her, having her in these uncomfortable, contorted positions that were so bad she'd almost pass out. And after she'd come to, he would be right on top of her again, being super aggressive. To nobody's surprise, Ghislaine Maxwell was becoming more nasty, as if she couldn't get any more nastier. She had just turned 40, and it seemed that aging was making her more and more bitter. It makes sense if you think about it. This is no excuse, but it makes sense because Epstein didn't like anyone that was over 20, and Ghislaine was now 2 decades past the age of 20. So she was considered aged out, and she was really taking it out on the girls more. To make matters worse, Virginia would be trafficked to one of her most violent abusers yet, on Epstein's Island. A prime minister who she couldn't name. On their second interaction, she had just had it. The guy wanted to choke her. He asphyxiated her and injured her. And when she cried and begged for him to stop, that just thrilled the prime minister even more. It was hard for her to breathe or swallow for days after that. She was falling apart, and understandably so. But the final straw was in the summer of 2010. When Virginia was 18 years old, Epstein and Ghislaine took her snorkeling by the reefs of the Epstein Islands. And afterwards, they presented her with a proposal, which was one that would surely change the course of her life forever. Epstein revealed to Virginia that he and Ghislaine wanted to have a baby, and they wanted Virginia to be the surrogate mother of their child, meaning she would be the one being inseminated with their fetus, and she would carry the baby to term and give birth to a child that would not belong to her. And Epstein's ego was so inflated. The money, the power, and corruption had been getting to him for years, and he genuinely expressed to Virginia about seeding the human race with his DNA. The couple told Virginia that if she agreed to this, if she carried the baby and birthed their child, she would have to sign all legal rights away for the child to Epstein and Ghislaine. That if there were any conflict or end to their relationship in the end, she wouldn't have any custody or access to this child. As part of the contract, she would have to also be on standby and ready to care for this child whenever Epstein and Ghislaine requested it. And in return, Epstein would buy her a mansion in Palm Beach, Florida, or Manhattan, New York, and provide her with a hefty monthly allowance. Virginia was smart. She responded that she needed some time to think over the proposal. Virginia knew that she didn't want to bring a child like this into the world. She didn't want to bring another child in the world that Epstein and Ghislaine could do with as they pleased. In her own words, she wrote, "What if this child was a girl?" Virginia was also scared to say no, though, so she eventually told them she needed to take some time to think about it. And then later she came back and told them yes if they agreed on one condition, that they'd pay for her to become a formally trained and certified massage therapist. On day one of meeting Ghislaine had, after all, offered her a job interview to be a massage therapist for a wealthy man, but they'd never paid for schooling. So Virginia was never formally trained. The situation had been so vastly different than being a masseuse. The other thing was maybe doing a massage training program would also buy Virginia more time to think of an escape plan. Because the agreement was that she wouldn't start having this child until she finished her formal training. So Ghislaine and Epstein agreed to send her to an institution called International Training Massage School, which we will refer to as ITM for short. And this would be an 8-week massage training program to get certified in Thai massage, located in Chiang Mai in Thailand. And Virginia was genuinely surprised that they didn't want her closer to them where they could control her and keep a close eye on her. Remember that not only had Virginia been loyal to them for 2 years, but they were also trying to traffic another girl from Thailand. And they wanted Virginia to be the one to go to Thailand and recruit her. So once again, there was a selfish reason behind sending her to Thailand. So Virginia was sent to pack her belongings in preparation for her schooling in Thailand, back to her Royal Palm Beach apartment in Florida, where her boyfriend Tony Figueroa and her Chow Chow dog Mary Jane were. And she knew that in order to escape, this would have to be her final goodbye to the two of them. It would be the final time she would be in that Royal Palm Beach apartment, which makes me so sad because I'm always sad when dogs are abandoned. I mean, I know the situation is different and she really needs to look out for herself for once. But I'm even sad about her leaving Tony Figueroa. As much of a deadbeat as he was, let's face it.
He got her fired from her job at TGIF. He almost got her arrested then and there, and he was not loyal to her. But there's a part of me that can't help but feel sorry for him because he lost his virginity to Virginia. He came looking for her, and he came from a struggling background himself, it sounds like. Then he was hit with the reality, and it's nobody's fault, but he was hit with the reality that she is being trafficked. And it doesn't sound like he has a great support system, so he takes it out with these poor coping mechanisms. So years later, you learn about him giving interviews saying she was coming home terrified. He felt helpless, and he wasn't a great guy to her, but you can't help but feel like they were just kids.
At the end of the day, she needed somebody stronger to help her get out of this mess that she was in. And to Tony's defense, he did end up serving as a witness, called up to the stand to testify, give a testimony years later down the road when Virginia Giuffre started to have to go to these depositions, and they helped her in her favor. So I'll give him that. When it finally came time for Virginia to board her plane from Miami back to New York, from where she would be departing to Thailand, she had packed all her mementos and she was sobbing as she said goodbye to Tony. It's sad to picture these two young kids, at least for me. She arrived in Thailand. Ghislaine had continued to mention that she would be calling Virginia, checking up on Virginia from abroad, and making sure that Virginia was making progress on finding this girl from Thailand that they wanted her to traffic. Not only that, they wanted Virginia to train the girl who would be replacing her for Epstein in her absence, which is just sick. And Virginia mentions in her book feeling very replaceable while this was happening, even though she wanted to get away from Epstein. It just showed how disconnected he was from any of these girls. So Virginia flies into Thailand, and her first 2 nights in Thailand, she stayed in her hotel that they booked her because she was afraid of getting in trouble, afraid of being unavailable right at Ghislaine's every whim. But being through all the trauma she'd been through, also going cold turkey from Xanax and all the drugs she had taken to dissociate back in the States, Virginia quickly fell in with what she called the party group at ITM, which consisted of smoking weed with her classmates and staying out late drinking. She was really enjoying her newfound freedom and just being around people her own age. She befriended a young man in ITM by the name of Matthew Olson, a tall Australian in his 20s, who would later introduce her to a longtime friend with whom he traveled to Thailand with, and that was his friend Robbie. And Robbie had come to Thailand for his own reasons, which was to practice Muay Thai. Robbie was very attractive to Virginia when they first met. He was tall and lean with dark features that he had inherited from his Sicilian side. His Sicilian family had immigrated to Australia, and when Virginia and Robbie met, the sparks were everywhere. The two of them soon began hanging out all the time, And Robbie began coming over to Virginia's very luxurious hotel in Thailand. And as he did, he couldn't help but notice how odd it was that this young girl, barely 19 years old, could stay in this expensive hotel with all these fancy accommodations. And instead of coming up with some kind of excuse, I guess, saying she was from a rich family, well, she told him everything. She worked for a very powerful and wealthy man and his mistress, who was a recruiter for him and had a number of young women working under them. And in that moment, learning what she was running away from and how her family had never stood by her side and that she had nowhere to go after this massage program came to an end, Robbie offered her an out, a marriage proposal. He proposed to her and she saw him as her knight in shining armor. She didn't understand much about love, but she said she loved him. And on October 16, 2002, the two of them got married at the top mountain of a temple called the War Fra Thought Dol Sutha. And I'm so sorry, I don't speak Thai, so I'm sure I butchered it, but I will put a video or picture of it up on my YouTube. And at the end of that day, she promised she'd make a phone call for Robbie to none other than Jeffrey Epstein, a phone call to end it. She called him and told him she'd gotten married and was never coming back. And all Epstein said was, "Have a nice life," and hung up on her. And she didn't hear from Epstein until 5 years later. Virginia eventually moved to Australia with Robbie, and the two lived with his family. They had 2 sons, and their third child would be a baby girl. And I'm going to skip through a lot of the lovey-dovey stuff with Robbie because as much as the book really speaks highly of Robbie, I have mixed feelings about this relationship as well as mixed insight. I don't know what to believe, but the internet, the news articles I've seen are saying now that Virginia was actually in a very abusive relationship with Robbie for years. And again, I don't know what's true. I'm not accusing anybody of anything, but up to her death, there were so many weird things that happened, such as all the bruising she had on her face. And her friend said that Robbie had broken her sternum and filed a restraining order against her and her 3 children so she couldn't see them anymore. So I don't know how I feel about Robbie. If those are true, I really don't like him as a person, and I'm really sad for her that this wasn't her happy ending. Despite having 3 children who Virginia loved dearly, she was never able to live a normal life again. All that time that she had been abused, which was, let's face it, her whole life, with starting with her father and then his friend Forrest, there were challenges after Ron Eppinger, after Epstein. She didn't know how to do basic things. For example, one time Robbie offered to give her some money to buy furniture for the house, and she mentions in the book that she was terrified at the thought of going and buying furniture. She had never done that before. She had never seen anyone buy furniture, which is just so sad because it shows you of the life that she was robbed. She took that money and bought an Xbox instead because she was so lonely at home. Not to mention, she was running out of her stash of Xanax. Like, she was starting to have to face reality, face these images that she had been trying to get out of her mind for years with all these men abusing her. She struggled with certain sexual acts, even with Robbie, and he demanded to know why she was feeling this way. So I'm sure there's a part of her that wishes she didn't have to share these things with her own husband, if you know what I mean. And that in itself is traumatizing. She, at one point, began to cut herself because of all the images in her head. Life was unbearable at times. In 2006, Virginia was pregnant and gave birth to Alex Giuffre, her oldest son. And 5 months later, that same year, she was pregnant with another baby. And in 2006, Virginia actually tried to reunite with her father, which most of us are probably like, why? Even her husband, Robbie Giuffre, was like, why? But there was a part of her that was just so sweet. She really wanted to have this solid family, and she got that from Robbie's parents. They were there for her. They were the parents that she didn't have growing up, and it made her miss her parents, and she wanted that in her life again. But more things unfolded, and I won't get into those, so that you can read about them. But there did come a point where eventually she just didn't trust her father alone with her kids. She never really did, and he just kept crossing boundary after boundary, and she was finally just like, goodbye, Dad, I can't. So that's good, but it just goes to show you how she really was a nurturing and forgiving person, despite if somebody had hurt her before. One day in 2007, while Virginia was still pregnant with her second child, she received a phone call from a familiar voice, a voice she had not heard for 5 years, but it was certainly one that would haunt her and had been haunting her. a British voice, none other than Ghislaine Maxwell's sing-songy, cooing voice. And as you can imagine, Virginia never told Epstein and Ghislaine where she moved to. She didn't want them to know, but they had tracked her down. And the reason Ghislaine had tracked her down after making all this stupid chit chat was because she wanted to ask Virginia if anyone had been trying to interview Virginia. And as it turns out, 2 years prior, on March 14th, 2005 in Florida, the stepmother of a 14-year-old girl called the Palm Beach Police Department to report that her child had been molested 5 weeks earlier by a wealthy Palm Beach resident. And in her statement, the 14-year-old girl gave a detailed account of everything that had happened to her, which was almost identical to Virginia's first encounter with Epstein, being offered a job to a wealthy man, being led up a staircase to Jeffrey Epstein lying naked on a massage, having another girl normalize it and tell her how to do it, being ordered to be SA'd by Epstein, just sick. And after the Palm Beach police got this report, they launched an investigation on Jeffrey Epstein, and there was a period of 13 months. They tracked down 30 victims to make statements, and these victims were between the ages of 14 to 17. On October 20th, 2005, officers brought a search warrant to the Palm Beach mansion and seized the photographs of naked girls and incriminating notes between Epstein and some of his colleagues.
There were a lot of code words such as she's 2 times 8, 2 by 8, which means 16 years old, like code words like that.
But it was clear from the get-go that there was a lot of fumbling and corruption within the Palm Beach police station. And we'll get to that. On February 2006, investigations requested a grand jury session where all of the victims who had been interviewed would be called to testify. But Epstein's defense was made up of the most high-profile attorneys, and they were good at smearing the credibility of these victims and postponing the grand jury. Epstein had people working for him who would reach out to these victims and offer them large sums of payments for staying silent. And he had connections in the judicial system that would find ways to jeopardize any information to have a grand jury or cause further defamation of his character. And let me just remind you that when Virginia got a phone call from Ghislaine Maxwell, Ghislaine proceeded to acting surprised, saying, "Can you believe that these girls are doing to Epstein what they're doing after all these years helping them? Oh, if you ever need any legal team, let us know. We got you, and we'll pay you a large sum of money to keep your mouth shut." And at the time, Virginia had a 1-year-old, and she was also 8 months pregnant. Like, she wasn't trying to deal with this. She had her husband to protect, so she just said no. She agreed to not talk, to not tell anybody anything she knew, and refused to cooperate with any investigation. But it was only a few days after that Epstein called Virginia Giuffre himself. He even informed her that his team of high-profile lawyers were taping the phone conversation. It would later be revealed to Virginia that his high-profile dream team was made up of Gerald Lefcourt, Roy Black, and former U.S. Solicitor Ken Starr, among others. It was becoming clear to Virginia that Jeffrey's lawyers were drawing the typical smear campaign against anybody and all who would come forward against Epstein, stating that they were allegations made by women who were not credible. These women were strippers, prostitutes, drug addicts. Virginia stated in her book, "I didn't need a translator to grasp that his not-so-subtle point was the accusers had no credibility, and anyone who turned against Epstein was a skank who'd be discredited." So as you can imagine, as a mother of 2, well, 1 going on 2 at the time, Virginia just kept to herself. She didn't want to be involved. She had a lot on the line. So once again, she swallowed her pride and terror, and she said she wouldn't talk to anybody. And a few days later, the FBI reached out to her, practically interrogating her with questions like, "Have you had sex with Epstein? There's photos of you we found in the Palm Beach house. Has he ever ejaculated in front of you?" Very straight to the point questions without considering any feelings or concerns the victim might have. Virginia was obviously, for good reasons, scared. She also didn't even know if this was the FBI for real or if it was one of Jeffrey's cronies trying to get more intel for him. So she said she knew nothing and ended the conversation. If it wasn't them and the lawyers of Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell tracking her down, or the FBI or so-called FBI, then it was other journalists, other witnesses' lawyers, and they would all find out where she was, where her family was, and try to get information from her, even if it meant crossing her boundaries.
On May 2006, a very frustrated Detective Riccieri, who was investigating this Jeffrey Epstein case, he sent requests for arrest warrant for Epstein for 4 counts of unlawful sexual activity with certain minors and 1 count of an arrest warrant of lewd and lascivious molestation. I don't know what that means. Let's look that up. So lascivious. Let's pronounce that.
Lascivious.
Lascivious. So lascivious means feeling or revealing an overt and often offensive sexual desire. But in this case, it's for lascivious molestation. So Detective Riccieri, he wanted these search warrants. He sent requests for these search warrants. 4 counts of unlawful sexual activity with certain minors and 1 count of lewd and lascivious molestation. And on July 2006, over a year after the incident where that 14-year-old victim's stepmother reported that her child had been molested, Epstein was finally arrested, but only for 2 state felony charges: procuring a minor for prostitution and solicitation of a prostitute, which that just bothers me in itself because this is a 14-year-old girl. She's not a prostitute. She is being RAPE'd. She is being assaulted. And all of this is beyond her ability to give a consent. Again, this 14-year-old is not a prostitute. She's a child. She's a victim. He was able to post a $3,000 bond and go home, which is just such a slap in the face. Do you know what $3,000 is to Jeffrey Epstein? I could come up with $3,000. Jeffrey Epstein is a billionaire. He should not be getting a bond of $3,000 and going home. Of all the victims interviewed, only 2 of them gave witness testimonies, and the grand jury only charged him with a felony charge of soliciting prostitution, to which he pled not guilty. And I wonder why only 2 of them were able to give testimonies. Could it be that his dream team of high-profile lawyers scared the shit out of everybody and also gave them an unspoken lump sum of money to keep their mouth shut, which I'm sure many of these witnesses would have needed, because remember, he targeted girls that were from very desperate pasts, girls that were most likely running away from their own families, their own jaded families. Okay, but this is part of the reason why Epstein was able to get away with things for so long. So he pled not guilty. And a very frustrated Detective Riccieri felt that this entire case had been botched. And it clearly had been. Because remember, in the beginning of Virginia Giuffre's book, in the beginning of her deciding to work full-time for Jeffrey Epstein, one of the first things he did was show her a picture of her brother Skydie and say, hey, I know that this is your baby brother who means the world to you. We know where he goes to school. Say anything and we will harm him and you. And don't forget that I own the police department down here. So this case was clearly botched. Somebody had been warning Jeffrey Epstein. I don't know who. It doesn't say who in the book. We may never know. But there was a lot of preparation on his part, not to mention his team of excellent lawyers who are just good at running a smearing campaign. Once again, they labeled that these people making these allegations were prostitutes. I hate that word, prostitutes, because it's like, oh my God, don't even get me started. We'll do that another episode on that. But they were alleging that they were prostitutes, drug addicts, people that were mentally off. So really doing a smear campaign against anyone and everybody that spoke up against Epstein, which, by the way, is a tactic they use universally when any victim of violence, when any victim of SA or RAPE comes forward against a very powerful man, by the way. And I hope to cover many more cases, because this isn't something that just happens in America. It happens in Korea, it happens in Japan, it happens in China, like Africa. We will get there. And I will have many more stories for you about these types of situations where the very wealthy just throw these labels that are very harmful and the public eats it up. And a lot of times the public isn't even aware about it because these plea deals are made before the prosecution can even do anything about it. So anyways, Detective Riccieri, frustrated, rightfully so, took this case to the FBI. Remember, Jeffrey Epstein had informed Virginia early on that he practically owned the Palm Beach Police Department, and that was seeming to be true. He was getting away with a lot. And in 2008, Virginia received a letter from the U.S. Department of Justice that said she was being contacted as an identified victim of a federal offense, which mentioned an ongoing investigation, and it also gave her the number of a lawyer named Robert Joseph Spurg. I think I'm messing that up, but I will get some more info on that. Robert Joseph Spurg to contact. And this lawyer worked with his daughter as well. So it was like a family law team. And remember, at this point, Virginia, she was still just getting used to being a mother. She wanted to protect her family. At this point, she was kind of staying out of this, but she just kept getting contacted. Everybody wanted something from her, whether it was Jeffrey Epstein's lawyers wanting to make sure she kept her mouth shut, whether it was Ghislaine, whether it was Jeffrey Epstein himself telling her to keep her mouth shut. Then there was journalists and there was investigators, and nobody was really offering her any counseling on where she was emotionally. Everybody just wanted something from the victim, which is something that happens in our judicial system. However, okay, so we're going to backtrack a bit. And I'm sorry that this timeline gets very confusing, because it's like Virginia Giuffre gets away from Epstein. She goes to Thailand. She finds her Prince Charming, even though we don't think he's her Prince Charming anymore. She finds Robert Giuffre. They start a whole new life in Australia, and this timeline gets confusing because before she's even aware that there's an investigation going on, there are other victims that are starting to they're starting to come forward about everything that Epstein has been doing. And she's getting this information bit by bit. It's not like she has a lawyer that's cluing her in on every step. She's finding things out bit by bit. So some of this stuff is happening a lot of it is happening before she's even getting involved. And I'm not going to talk about the Farmer sisters today. I believe it's Annie Farmer, and there's another sister with the same last name who were trafficked. And they are actually the other heroes in this story, because they have for decades been trying to take down Ghislaine Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein. And there's other victims. So Virginia Giuffre just kept getting sucked in because there were all these cases going on where people were finding pictures of her. She was getting named. She was being contacted by attorneys, investigators, the paparazzi, who just could not stay away from her. Even if she wanted privacy, it was starting to get to the point where she couldn't live a normal life. Like, once you're a victim, you think you're out, but in her case, she wasn't out. People just kept wanting more and more from her. So that's why it pisses me off so much when people like, whatever her name is, Prince, well, he's no longer a prince, Prince Andrew's ex-girlfriend, people like that are like, oh, she's the cash cow, they couldn't use her anymore, because she does say this in an interview.
Definitely, like, things were catching up with her. The lies were catching up. She was sort of finally crumbling, and I feel like at that point she was no good to the lawyers anymore. The cash cow of Virginia Giuffre being able to sue so many people, that was gone.
She's the cash cow. She couldn't make any more money off of Epstein. It's like, no, originally she just wanted to live a normal life. She wanted to be a mother. And she mentions in her book, don't forget that once people are able to look you up and see that you were a victim of SA and you're in a large international lawsuits like this, defamation lawsuits, you're being held in depositions, people can look that up. That's public information. People can find out where you live. They can find out where you work. And at some point, you're not hireable anymore. You can't live a normal life anymore. And your spouse might not be able to live a normal life, especially when there are children involved. Like, they could be getting hounded by paparazzi. At one point in the book, she even mentions paparazzi following her to a doctor's appointment. She's taking one of her kids to a doctor's appointment, and as soon as she leaves with her child, people are in her face, taking pictures, posting where she lives. And this is a woman who tried so hard she moved across the world to get away from Epstein. And so do not come at these victims and say that they are money hungry, because sometimes being in a lawsuit and getting a settlement, that's the only money them and their family will ever see. And that will be the only protection they can ever get. Okay, that's my rant. I'm going to stop now. I'm going to continue on my notes.
In 2008, Virginia received a letter from the U.S. Department of Justice that said she was being contacted, okay, this is why I went on a tangent, as an identified victim of a federal offense, which mentioned an ongoing investigation, and it also gave her the number of a lawyer to call, Robert Joseph Sjoberg, to contact. However, prior to that letter being given to Virginia in September 2007, a plea deal had already been in the works, and this was without Virginia's knowledge. Without informing any of Epstein's victims, unbeknownst to any of his victims, he had already entered a secret non-prosecution agreement with the government. For Jeffrey Epstein, the government had made a plea deal which canceled the trial that would have been set for January 2008. Remember, that was when they were contacting Virginia and all the victims that would have information on Jeffrey Epstein. But a whole year before that, September 2007, Epstein had made a never-before-made, unprecedented plea deal with the U.S. government, which included excusing his name and, it would excuse the name and unnamed conspirators and co-conspirators that were working for Epstein without any reprimanding, they would not be punished. This list, which included many of the names of the female recruiters Virginia recognized from the time that she herself was being trafficked under Epstein. Epstein, eventually, he was only sentenced to 18 months in prison. That's a year and a half. That's a year and a half for all the heinous things he did because he was in this plea deal. And this plea deal was in exchange, he would get 18 months in prison for pleading guilty to the state's charge. Charge 1, procuring a child for prostitution and soliciting a prostitute. And this had all happened before Virginia was even made aware of the investigation and the lawyer Robert Joseph Sjoberg. So this attorney they gave her the number to, he was really just trying to figure out what these victims wanted to be confiscated. What is the number that you are willing to ask for to just let this plea deal happen? And she didn't want to do a plea deal. She wanted to take Epstein down. She didn't want this to happen to anybody else as it had happened to her. So Robert Joseph Sjoberg was simply a number to call to get settlement money since there would be no prosecution. And she didn't know this at the time. Virginia said in her book, she thought she was talking to a lawyer to take him to court to get ready to prosecute Jeffrey Epstein, only for months later for the lawyer to inform her that Jeffrey Epstein and her and his other victims just needed to list their restitution prices. And understandably, she was outraged. We also know now that Epstein enjoyed a lot of privileges that are unheard of to other prisoners. During the time that he served, he was actually released after 13 months. And if that is not frustrating to hear enough, we know that he enjoyed privileges such as being able to go to the office of his nonprofit that he created. And this nonprofit was known as the Florida Science Foundation. And because he had this nonprofit, even while he was in prison, he was permitted to visit this office of his up to 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, where he continued to molest girls. A foundation that was also, ironically enough, dissolved after he was released from jail. So what was he doing this whole time, going 12 hours a day, 6 days a week to this science foundation, one that he created? He was there potentially continuing to traffic and molest girls. Then after that, he was put on house arrest after his release, and his conditions under house arrest were equally lax because we have evidence now that he was allowed frequent trips to New York and frequent trips to his private island, Little St. Jeff's, and we all know what happened on those islands. The only option that Virginia Giuffre eventually learned that she had, because he couldn't be prosecuted, was to file a civil lawsuit against Jeffrey Epstein. And Virginia learned this through her attorney, Sigrid. We will call her Siggy. And Virginia did this in May of 2009 under a pseudonym, Jane Doe 102, describing her first encounter with Epstein and Maxwell and accusing them of sexual exploitation, abuse, and battery, as well as being exploited to Epstein's friends, who were businessmen, academics, politicians, royalty, the scum of the wealthy. And it made note that Epstein preferred underage girls. The suit stated that Virginia had suffered and will in the future continue to suffer physical injury, mental anguish, humiliation, confusion, embarrassment, loss of educational opportunities, loss of self-esteem, loss of dignity, invasion of privacy, separation from her family, and other damages. This plaintiff has suffered a loss of income, a capacity to earn income in the future, and a loss of the capacity to enjoy life. These injuries are permanent in nature. And that just goes hand in hand with what I was just talking about. Virginia's critics and the critics of those who came forward about Epstein, which is unbelievable that people do that, complain that these girls, they just want money. But like I said earlier, these girls have suffered a huge gap in their resume. How do you explain when you've been trafficked to multiple people that there are days that you are mentally traumatized, that you are in fight or flight, that you need money to go get counseling at the very least? How do you explain this gap in your resume where you have not been able to work or have anything on paper, and that you don't know how to carry yourself sometimes in the real world? And that you're walking around with everyone knowing your business. Like Virginia said in her book, all people had to do was look her up, and then they didn't want to hire her. And it's sad, but people are very reluctant to hire somebody that's been in a lawsuit for many reasons. That's what her lawyer, her legal team wrote. They said that about her. And to this day, or to the end of her life, she knew that. She needed this money. This was all she had. And in July 2009, Epstein was released from jail after only serving 13 months, placed on house arrest for 1 year, which, as we know, he was doing whatever the heck he wanted. He had special privileges. And I wouldn't be surprised if it was because he has a lot of intel on people higher up than him, people in the judicial system. He has said that he can blackmail people. A lot of the victims who were later interviewed stated that Epstein had cameras all around his mansions. He could blackmail anyone he wanted. So, of course, the laws were in his favor. In 2009, he continued to keep his claim that he was innocent. Virginia was understandably becoming more and more concerned for her safety and the safety of her children and her husband. She said since her motion had been filed in the CVRA case, Virginia stated in her book, "We had come home more than once to find evidence that strangers had been inside our house. Robbie," that's her husband, "was vigilant about placing wooden drop bars in the windows and doors to prevent them from being open, and he always deadbolted our locks. Nonetheless, it was becoming routine for us to come home to find the deadbolts unlocked. One afternoon, we came back from a trip from Walmart to find our front door wide open." That's freaking terrifying. Our Malamute, those are the dogs that look like huskies. I love them so much. Our Malamute, who we had left inside, was out in the street. We called the sheriff's department, and when we told the deputies that nothing had been stolen, they speculated that intruders might have entered in order to install some kind of spyware on our computers. The deputies recommended putting surveillance cameras to seek the make and model of every vehicle that drove up and down the street. Virginia and her husband were then also advised to get protection. And when I say protection, I'm talking guns. They got really good at shooting. Her and her husband both ended up purchasing their own guns. They even named their guns. I can't recall the name of their guns off the top of their head. And for a while, they were regular members at the shooting range. So this is how fearful for their lives they were. They were also getting harassed by paparazzi, like I said. And the paparazzi were taking pictures of them everywhere they went and posting where they lived. Like the last thing you need when somebody as powerful as Jeffrey Epstein and his unnamed cronies are freaking keeping an eye on you already. They were finding it so easy to find Virginia, and they would state where she was living in Colorado. They even followed her to her children's doctor's appointments. She was also run off the road one time by what she believed were tabloid journalists. It was even affecting Robbie so much that he was having to take side streets to do anything to avoid the paparazzi. So fast forward to April of 2015. On April 7th, Judge Kenneth Mara, this is a judge presiding over the CVRA case, stated that Virginia couldn't join as Judge Jane Doe because the file was duplicitous of the existing lawsuit. And the judge also ruled that Virginia's allegations from Prince Andrew and others that she had named should be removed from the record, stating that the details were impertinent and unnecessary. Like, what? Doesn't that automatically make you feel like somebody is involved if they're saying that these allegations are not important to this case of CVRA? Despite Virginia's frustrations with this news, Virginia's attorneys were coy. Her legal team stated that they had absolutely respected the judge's decisions and wrote that she'd still be happy to get to participate in the CVRA case anyway, despite the details on Prince Andrew and, let's face it, other powerful people she was speaking of being dropped. And of course they weren't happy, but they were doing what they could to include her so that she continued to be in the trial, because she's a very important voice. Behind the scenes, Virginia's very brilliant lawyer, Sigrid Macaulay, who she called Siggy, had been working tirelessly behind the scenes to help draw national attention to Virginia's case and to counteract the powers that be, these powers that keep siding with Jeffrey Epstein. By speaking with numerous media sources and TV networks, Sigrid Macaulay, Virginia's lawyer, said that everybody was interested in interviewing Virginia. So eventually, Virginia decided to do a public interview with ABC after giving it much thought, because she was a fan of the news reporter Roebuck. A segment from the interview was to air on Good Morning America. Virginia prepared very hard for this interview. She really wanted to point out that because she was a mother and she wanted a safer world for her daughter, a safer world for all women. She wanted to fight trafficking. She didn't want men like Epstein to get away with what they were doing. And the interview went great. She remembers leaving the interview feeling so proud, like she was making the world a better place. But then once the interview was supposed to air, ABC never aired the interview. 4 years later, on November 5th, 2019, there was footage caught of Amy Robach saying, "Every day I get more and more pissed that Virginia's interview with me never aired." Higher-ups had told Amy Robach that people pretended not to know who Jeffrey Epstein was, and they said, no one knows who Epstein is. They're not going to care. They're not going to be interested in this interview, which is insane because there are plenty of other interviews out there already at this time of Jeffrey Epstein. And there was also pushback from the royal family, causing ABC to fear losing support from Kate Middleton and others in the royal family. So I think we know why that interview never aired. And it just shows that this was an uphill battle for so many reasons. There were too many powerful people that funded these television programs or who had a say in the future of these television programs. So unfortunately, that interview just never aired. In July 2015, things were becoming so dangerous, or feeling so dangerous, that Virginia Giuffre, she and her family moved back to Australia. Virginia actually one night noticed a car with its high beam lights on right in front of the driveway of her house. Something that she later learned was also occurring to other victims who had been speaking up about Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell. She ended up hiding her 3 children, hiding them in the closet, throwing clothes over them, and telling them to stay quiet, stay put. Mom's gonna take care of us. She did everything she could to hide her own fear and be strong for her family. And she got her gun, and she got her Malamute, whose name was Bear. I love dogs. And she opened the door with her gun cocked, and she just waved it around the door without the door open, but just cracking the door open a bit. She had her dog by her side, and she waved her gun. And this face-off with the car with the high beams, it happened for about 5 minutes before the car slowly went in reverse, backed away, and drove off. And for many nights after that, Virginia had slept with her revolver by her bed. Soon, her and her husband were just done with it. They moved back to Australia. And unfortunately, by this time, the Colorado Police Department had removed all the high security footage cameras that they had originally had around her house. Virginia's lawyer, Sigrid Macaulay, though, at this time, was studying in depth the area of law relating to defamation. Now that the Me Too movement was starting to catch on, laws relating to defamation were rapidly changing with the rise of the Me Too movement. And with that, Siggy pointed out that they could sue Ghislaine Maxwell for defamation. Because remember, Ghislaine Maxwell had dubbed Virginia a liar, saying that nothing Virginia said was credible, and this now constituted a defamation lawsuit. Ghislaine Maxwell's statements implied and inserted the fact that Virginia, and with that, they were able to sue Ghislaine Maxwell for defamation. And this was something new that couldn't be done before. Her statement implied Virginia had a right to defend herself. And in September of 2015, Siggy filed Virginia's claims against Ghislaine Maxwell in the Manhattan court, stating that Maxwell had made false and malicious claims against Virginia, defaming Virginia in Virginia's efforts to expose sex crimes committed around the world by Maxwell, Epstein, and other powerful people. Maxwell's denials damaged Virginia's credibility, making it possible for Epstein to continue sexually abusing Virginia Giuffre and other victims. Virginia Giuffre really wanted to let the world know at this point that becoming a mother had fueled her drive to take down people like Epstein and Maxwell, even more so now that she had a daughter that she brought into the world. She didn't want any young girls to experience the terror that she had gone through herself. And shortly after this, in 2016, this was the big year of depositions. Depositions against Ghislaine Maxwell, against Epstein, against Juan Alessi, who, if you remember from the very beginning of part 1, was Ghislaine Maxwell's private driver. There was also depositions for the 2 ex-boyfriends of Virginia's past, Tony Figueroa and Michael, who she had lived with while she was working for Epstein. Virginia had to travel 4 times back and forth between the United States and Australia during all of these depositions. And by the way, during this time, Robbie Giuffre's family was helping watch her kids, and she says in her book there was no way she could have done all these depositions without the help of her parents-in-law, because remember, her own parents sucked. They sucked at being her parents, and they sucked at being grandparents. And that's just my opinion, because she tried really hard to mend things with her father and with her mom, and they just sucked. Let's just be real. Even though her mom eventually, towards the end of the book, does, and I will mention, does apologize to Virginia, there's a point where it's just not enough. And it's like, you allowed your daughter to be trafficked more than once. Your daughter was trafficked 3 times, I would say, under your care. First to your husband's friend, Forrest, then to Ron Eppinger, then to Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell. So to me, her parents suck. No matter how much forgiveness she has in her heart, it's just a little too late. So she went back and forth between Australia and the States 4 times. And by the way, her parents were in those depositions too. You have to go to depositions, or you could be held by the court of law, or punished by the court of law. And her parents' true colors just continue to show when they were asked during the depositions. Virginia's mom calmly stated that she had no idea why Virginia quit her job at the Mar-a-Lago, and it seemed that Ghislaine Maxwell had become Virginia's new mommy, her new mommy figure, which is stupid. You're her mom, you're her mother figure, and you failed her. So F you for that. And Virginia's dad, Sky, who I personally think he was in on it. I personally think that, and I've heard some of you in the comment sections agree, like, we'll never know the truth probably, but I personally think that Sky was in on the trafficking. I think that he was getting paid off by somebody, because he trafficked her to Forrest. We could argue he essayed his own daughter, and he was super excited about her getting a job with Epstein after he introduced her to her job at the Mar-a-Lago. So of course, her dad, Sky, during the deposition said, Epstein seemed just fine to me. And that's not a helpful statement to make after everything's become known about what your daughter's gone through. That's what you're going to say? Epstein seemed fine to me? You're not going to even say, oh, maybe I should have actually gotten to know the guy. Maybe I should have actually met him. It just sounds so fishy to me. So even Virginia says that was like the hardest part of the deposition to hear about. It was harder to hear that her parents give those stupid statements than to hear about what the other victims went through. And I don't know if you guys remember Joanna Schoberg, but she also gave a deposition that actually helped back up what Virginia had to say. Remember, Joanna Schoberg was the second girl that was present, the second time that Virginia Giuffre was trafficked to Prince Andrew. It was 2 of them the second time. The first time was Virginia Giuffre by herself. The second time was her with Joanna Schoberg. Again, this was all organized by Ghislaine Maxwell, and there was actually a picture that Ghislaine Maxwell took that is not in the book, but Joanna Schoberg and Virginia Giuffre both confirmed it, that this is so gross and infuriating. Ghislaine Maxwell took a Muppet that looked like Prince Andrew, and she took that puppet and put it on Virginia's breast. And then she had Joanna Schoberg put her hand on Prince Andrew or something like that. And I remember in the book, Virginia Giuffre said, this was just a very clear statement that we were their puppets. And it's like, yeah, it sounds like you guys are being their puppets. You guys are their slaves. You guys are being trafficked by these adults. You're both underage. So Joanna Schoberg's deposition included that she was approached by Maxwell. Schoberg at the time was 21 years old. Okay, so Schoberg was 21 years old, but what happened to her was still wrong. She was a 21-year-old student who was offered a job by Ghislaine Maxwell. Once again, Ghislaine Maxwell, I don't know why currently in interviews she's telling people she didn't help traffic these girls, because she clearly did. There are multiple witness accounts of this. So in Joanna Schoberg's case, Ghislaine Maxwell came up to her while Joanna Schoberg was a 21-year-old student in school. Ghislaine offered her job as something sort of like a butler, an assistant, and sooner than later, Ghislaine Maxwell began grooming and teaching Joanna Schoberg how to give massages to Epstein. It became, you're a butler, oh now you're a foot masseuse. Okay, then she just started trafficking her. And eventually, Joanna Schoberg was trafficked as well. And she also corroborated Virginia's story that she was with Prince Andrew and Virginia Giuffre that second night. So the deposition with Maxwell would be the longest and most ridiculous one. To Virginia Giuffre's lawyer's surprise, Siggy's surprise, and her other lawyers, they thought Maxwell was going to plead the fifth because there's just so much overwhelming evidence against her at this point. However, Maxwell didn't plead the fifth. And on the date of the hearing, which was April 27, 2016, the questions the lawyers asked, the prosecution asked Ghislaine Maxwell took a grueling 10 hours because Ghislaine was distracting. She was trying to distract from everything. She was trying to just go off topic and gaslight everybody. And it was apparently so bad that even the typewriter in the room, the court typewriter, was scared because Ghislaine Maxwell, towards the end of this grueling 10-hour deposition interview, was getting really pissed off. It started out with her just playing the semantics game. For example, Siggy would ask her, is it true that you recruited girls? And Ghislaine Maxwell in response would say the dumbest shit. Sorry, pardon my French. She would say stuff like, I don't know what you mean by recruit. I don't know what you mean by female. And Siggy would be like, well, are you a female? So it would be hours of, I don't know what this means. And they'd have to describe words like girl, recruit, massage. Siggy asked her, did you keep a basket of toys by the bedroom? And Ghislaine Maxwell would say, I don't know what toys you're talking about. So it was just 10 hours of this BS. And that happened on April 22nd. And this defamation lawsuit was a huge deal. Even though it didn't get anyone arrested, it was a huge deal. Even though it didn't get anyone arrested, and it resulted in Ghislaine Maxwell having to pay out Virginia Giuffre, what it did do why it was so important was because it broke the case wide open for all these accusations of child trafficking, of child grooming, all these things were now court documented. And it helped the cases later on that were to follow that would get Ghislaine Maxwell arrested eventually. Ghislaine was also caught lying under oath in front of the judges during this defamation case. It revealed more information that would become public regarding Ghislaine's involvement with trafficking and grooming girls for Epstein, and later laid the foundations for perjury charges that would later be brought up in Maxwell's sex trafficking trial. So the civil case was eventually settled in 2017, and it was just a big game changer. And in fact, like I said, two sisters, Annie and Maria Farmer, had been trying for nearly 2 decades to fight and come public about what Epstein had done for them. And I heard that one of them, Annie Farmer, I believe, is actually fighting cancer right now, and she's an amazing artist, and she was one of the first victims of Epstein to come forward about being trafficked, and she also plans to write a book, so I hope that happens for her, because I will be the first to read it. So more and more women were choosing to break their silence. And October of 2016, another African woman said she had been trafficked in 2006 and 2007. She had photographs to prove, and she had served as a witness in the defamation case that Virginia Giuffre had as well. In 2017, Donald Trump was president, and he nominated Alexander Acosta to be the Secretary of Labor. And this was the former federal prosecutor based in Miami who, remember that weird ass plea deal that was unprecedented where Jeffrey Epstein got like 13 months in prison with all these with all this privilege, and it was put under house arrest for a year with all this privilege. Alexander Acosta, the Secretary of Labor, he is actually the one that approved Epstein's secretive plea deal, and Donald Trump nominated him to be the Secretary of Labor in 2017. So I just want to put that out there. On July 6, 2019, Epstein was arrested Federal agents found thousands of pictures of nude women and 3 passports that belonged to Jeffrey Epstein. He had an Israeli passport, a U.S. passport, and an Austrian passport. And the Austrian passport was under a fake name with an address somewhere in Saudi Arabia or something. So he definitely was a flight risk. He had a max sentence potential of 45 years. And July 19, 2019, that POS Alexander Acosta, who Donald Trump nominated as Secretary of Labor and had approved Epstein's secretive plea deal, unbeknownst to all the victims, he resigned from his position. Good. August 2019, Jeffrey Epstein was found dead in his cell. Guards in Manhattan found Epstein with a bedsheet tied around his neck. He was 66 years old. And I just want to say that Virginia Giuffre had a lot of doubts about whether this was actually a self-exit. And she was also disappointed because she said, this isn't how justice was supposed to work. I was grieving the death of my inability to hold him accountable. Nearly everything about Epstein's death seemed fishy. Even Attorney General William Barr would acknowledge he initially had suspicions that Epstein could have been murdered, although he later ruled that his death was a perfect storm of screw-ups. 2 prison guards who sat at a desk just 15 feet away were supposed to check in on him every half hour because a day before that or so, Jeffrey Epstein had been put on suicide watch. So they were supposed to be checking on him every half hour. And that's standard too in the hospital. If somebody is put on suicide watch, guards or nurses need to be checking on them. But this didn't happen in Jeffrey Epstein's case. So these guards were just 15 feet away. They were napping, browsing the internet, and then they falsified the logs saying that they had completed their checks. Security cameras, for some reason, were not functioning that day. And even Jeffrey Epstein's own brother hired a forensics pathologist who examined the initial autopsy report that experts concluded that the broken bones and cartilages in Epstein's neck pointed to homicide, not ending his own life. Virginia also said in her book, this is a man who bragged about his access to power. He had connections to Bill Gates, James Jeff Stanley, the CEO of Barclays Bank, and Leon Black, the co-founder of the private equity firm Apollo Global Management. According to court documents, Epstein also knew Google co-founders Sergey Brin and Larry Page. Epstein was the ultimate narcissist. He always talked about the videos he collected in his bedrooms and bathrooms, and these gave him power over others. He often bragged about his ability to blackmail. Virginia had every right to suspect this, and I think a lot of people suspect that somebody found a way to get rid of Epstein because they didn't want him to be blackmailing people, especially now that he was being investigated himself. They didn't want him to make a deal with somebody else by selling somebody else out. Virginia also added that Jeffrey Epstein on multiple occasions had bragged to her about how he was planning to put his body when he passed away in some cryogenic chamber to later be revived by newfound technology. And he is buried in an unmarked area near his parents. So I just want to put that out there. It sounds far-fetched, but we're talking about billionaires here. Also, what's ironic is 2 days on August 8th, before his death, Epstein had placed his entire fortune in a trust called 1953 in the Virgin Islands. And 1953 is the year Epstein was born. And this is also annoying because it affects how much restitution money his victims can get because his fortune is just hidden on a different island. Ghislaine Maxwell ended up being arrested by the FBI on July 2nd, 2020. Can't even talk. Ghislaine Maxwell was arrested by the FBI on July 2nd of 2020 during a raid at her mansion in Bradford, New Hampshire. And she was arrested before her trial because she was indicted by a grand jury on multiple federal charges, including sex trafficking and conspiracy, and she was considered an extreme flight risk. There were many instances where she just fled the country and said that she didn't know when she'd be back because somebody in her family was sick, and then she'd be seen at like a Clinton party or something. So good for them for doing that. Ghislaine Maxwell was found guilty, according to my notes, in December 2021 on 5 of 6 federal sex trafficking charges and sentenced to 20 years in prison. This was a criminal case, not a defamation case, though it stemmed in part from information revealed in that civil defamation suit. And she is currently trying to appeal this conviction. And as much as I would like to say, yeah, right, there are so many connections that these people have. And I don't know if you listen to Rotten Mango with Stephanie Sue, but she has been really really following all of the conspiracies and all of the things going on with Ghislaine Maxwell and the Epstein files. So I definitely recommend checking her page out. If you don't, she has 6 million followers, so you've probably already heard of her. But I just want to say that I kind of ended more on Ghislaine Maxwell and Epstein and where they eventually ended up. But all of this was made possible, like, Virginia Giuffre really laid the foundations. Even though she wasn't the first person to come forward about Jeffrey Epstein, her defamation lawsuit against Prince Andrew and Ghislaine Maxwell, it really broke the case wide open and laid the foundations for catching people in their lives later on. And I also want to say, again, that her brother Skydie has said in interviews that he was the one who found her body in Perth, Australia. But there is a lot of speculation on whether she ended it. And I honestly don't know what my opinion is. I do think that she had a lot of information on a lot more people that she didn't come forward about, such as this prime minister and this gubernatorial candidate. She mentions billionaire one, billionaire two. And I think a lot of people were also
threatened by her and scared of what she had to say.
She didn't leave a will. I know that she left a what is it called? She left a will. It wasn't a finalized will for the editor of her book, saying she wanted the money to go to her children. And then there's also a lot of speculation that her husband and also her lawyer said to interviewers that her husband, Robbie Giuffre, her hero, her bully basher, as she calls him in her book, was physically abusing her, broke her sternum, and her death was really suspicious. I mean, not only throughout her book is she talking about being stalked, people shining their headlights at her house, people like listing where she's living, her house being broken into. I know that she struggled with depression, but I just think that the timing is very strange. I think the fact that she called her editor and said that if anything happens to her, she wants this book published, I think that is just so
suspicious of the fact that maybe she knew something we didn't know. I mean, of course she did. Of course, when you're publishing such a book with so many high profile names in it, then I guess you do have to think about your own mortality. So maybe it's not weird, but her post on her hospitalization is another mystery that a lot of people are debating about. She said that she was given 4 days to live by a doctor, and there were also statements that she was suffering from renal failure. People have speculated that it's odd that she's wearing jewelry if she's being treated for renal failure or for a severe car accident. They would have removed that in the hospital. Another thing is that the police are claiming that there was no major crash on March 24th on the road 90 kilometers north of Perth, where she said she was hit by a school bus that had 29 children on board. The police are saying that there was only a minor crash. So things are mysterious to me.
You can't help but wonder if she was taken out by somebody more wealthy that really needed to keep her silent. I'm not making any allegations. These are all what I read, what people are saying. I'm just here to share my thoughts with you. So I will end on that note. What do you think? What do you think happened? Do you think Epstein took his own life? Do you think Virginia took her own life? Do you think Ghislaine Maxwell is in on it? Do you think she'll get pardoned? I have so many questions. What do you think? Please leave them on the comment section below. And again, you're listening to Morgan Vale. Thank you so much for your patience. I know that I wanted to release this last week, but again, I had dental issues. And if you're interested in my medical tourism travel channel, that's Laser Travels on YouTube, and I will link that below as well. Thanks again for watching, and stay safe out there, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks for listening, and you can now subscribe on TikTok, Spotify, Instagram, as well as YouTube on Shadecore with Morgan Vale. Stay safe.